Good afternoon to some, good morning to others. I am Alicia Brown, a customer success manager here at CourseDog, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar series that is focused on workflows. And I am joined by another team member. If you don't mind introducing yourself.
Yep, thanks, Alicia. Hi, folks. I'm Brian Smith. I'm the product manager for scheduling and events at CourseDog. So looking forward to sharing some info on workflows with you all today.
So thank you. So what is the webinar series that Customer Success hosts? The goal of this webinar is really to help you get the most use out of your CourseDog products. And we do that by providing overviews of important concepts and functionality, sharing tips and best practices, and we plan to do all of that today as it relates to workflows. As mentioned, today's session is focused on getting you more comfortable with all things workflow related. And so we'll start with an overview of important concepts and features within workflows. Then we'll take some time to talk through the use of post-approval workflow steps. And we'll close with some troubleshooting and frequently asked questions as it relates to workflows. There will also be an opportunity within this session to go through some live demonstrations on how to complete some of these steps on your own. As we progress through today's presentation, the chat function is open temporarily for you all to introduce yourself and what institution you represent. And then the Q&A box is open the entire time. So as you have questions, we do have 2 additional team members from our customer success team ready and willing to assist however they can there. So let's dive right into it. How are workflows used and why are they important? Workflows are used in events, scheduling, curriculum, and catalog to ensure that requests make it to the right people for approval. So what may have previously been an email thread or a Post-it note or a couple of trips up and down the hallway just to get something approved can now automatically be routed through a series of steps, which will in the end save you time. The goal of a workflow is to streamline communication and collaboration across multiple departments and reduce the likelihood of errors. Workflows are also meant to increase monitoring and visibility surrounding requests. So think of prior to CourseDog what you were doing. Prior to the use of workflows, you could have possibly forgotten to inform a department or a certain person of a request and then things slip through the cracks. So this helps eliminate that for you. And lastly, workflows are really meant to help minimize double bookings as well as some of the back and forth that's associated with getting a request approved. We'll start by showing an example version of a workflow. Workflows are usually mapped out during your implementation process, but can be edited or updated at any time after you're live. And they come in many different varieties. So as you look at this may not necessarily look like one of your workflows. I've seen quite a few that have lots of different elements and flowing arms and charts that's connecting everything together. And that really is dependent on the product that you're using and how you are using the workflow. So again, this is just an example visualization of what a workflow could look like so you can understand from step to step how it is mapped out for each of your requests. So as you are thinking about creating a new workflow, these are the basics that you'll need to keep in mind and just some best practices as you are moving from step to step. So step name. We do recommend that you choose a name that can be easily identified when you're reviewing the entire workflow. For instance, if you were to put step 1, that is vague. You never know. Step 1 might end up changing to step 3, and also there's not really a way to identify what is happening at that step. So we suggest that you are as detailed as possible in letting your team know and letting us know what the actual step is for. So think of event director approval or dean approval. Something that can quickly give you an idea of what's happening at that step. And if it needs to be moved around or changed, then you'll recognize what it is immediately. Participants are CourseDog users from your institution that you can assign to take a variety of actions on a request. That includes voting to move the step forward. And voting gives the participant permission to approve or reject a request. You may have multiple participants at a step and will need to set how many of those participants must provide approval prior to the request moving forward. This can be set in the votes required section. I'm actually going to move back up just a little bit to talk about the edit email templates option. So each step can send an email customized by your team to both the viewer and the author about the progress of the request. There is an opportunity to turn these off if maybe you want an email notification at some steps and not at others, and this can be done under workflow notifications. Rejection steps determine what happens to a request if it's denied at that specific step. There are a few different options to choose from, including that the request can go directly back to the author. In this case, they could possibly resubmit their request if they wanted to. You can also reject the request entirely. It is important to note if this option is chosen, once the event is gone, it's gone. It cannot be resurrected. It must be created again from scratch. And you can also return a workflow to its previous step. So if there was another office that approved it before you, it can go backwards. If you are choosing to reject a request, it's a best practice to include a comment, so the author or the previous approver understands why the request has been denied, and then they can choose how to remediate it if they choose to resubmit the request. Deadline is an optional step where you can assign how long a request can sit at a workflow step before the next action occurs. You can automatically notify a participant that their approval deadline is approaching via email, and then you can also decide what happens to a request if that deadline passes. And this is a helpful feature to prevent bottlenecks. Just in some of the conversations that I've had with some of the institutions that I work with, sometimes if there's no deadline, it just sits at a specific person. It's almost like sitting on their desk. It just sits at that step. So adding a deadline can be another best practice to make sure that things continue to move along. The final two steps that you'll see when adding a new workflow step are decisions and logic jumps. When you initially add a participant, you'll see a series of icons next to the name that indicate the many actions that they can take at their assigned step. Default decisions include the ability to vote, comment, suspend, edit, or what we refer to as force approve, which just skips all the steps and pushes it right to the end. And these can easily be toggled on and off based on what you'd like that specific participant to do. There may also be cases where additional action is warranted, and that's where this custom decision comes into play. You can create your own decision. So rather than having them approve the request, you can have them recommend approval or recommend rejection or add a specific type of comment. Logic jumps use a variety of predefined fields within the platform to help determine the path of a workflow step. You can use conditional logic along with the fields that are coming from the specific forms you're working with to move a request forward when it meets your set criteria. So you can think of this as maybe if someone submits a request on behalf of a specific organization, you can tell the workflow what to do if the alumni office submits a request versus maybe someone from the Greek Life office. The final step for creating a workflow is to tell the request where it should route next if it's approved. So we've talked about rejection, but if it's approved and we want it to move to the next step, there's a drop down that lists all of the other steps within the workflow that you can connect it to. So if you ever check your workflow and a step is visibly out of place, sometimes you can see that maybe there's just a box kind of hanging out in the wild. It could be because it's not connected to another step. So that's a good place to start when putting things back in order and making sure that it is connected to a previous step in the step that is following. And now we'll jump into a live demo of how to create a workflow step. This will also focus on the use of logic steps and then using reference fields within logic steps. So I will stop sharing my screen and I will pass it to Brian.
Right. Thanks, Alicia. Yeah, I just want to reiterate a lot of what Alicia just covered, but show it live in a demo environment here. So I'll just take us through a few different options and configurations in workflows. Please feel free as we go through this. Like we mentioned, please post any questions in the Q&A and we'll try to either cover them as we go through this little demo or save them for the end and touch on them. First step I want to take us through is just adding a new step to a workflow. So I'm looking at a workflow here in curriculum, But this could be the same in events or in scheduling. And here's an events workflow. As Alicia mentioned, these can be very complex or very straightforward. Here's a relatively complex workflow that we're looking at with a lot of different folks involved in the approval process: space reviewers, room approvals, resource approvals, and specific steps for specific types of requests like Greek orgs or student affairs. But at any point, if I want to come in here and edit my workflow and maybe add a step that I was previously missing, really straightforward, just click the blue add a new step button and begin going kind of from top to bottom here to add everything that you need. You'll give it a name. You'll be able to search here for all of the different participants that you want to add and allow them to have specific permissions on this step. A lot of different options here, from the ability to vote, to force approve, to edit, to comment. So you have lots of configuration and customizability in terms of what can each participant do. This can also be really helpful to just add a participant maybe who only needs to get an email notification, add them as a user who doesn't have any permissions except to view the request. So you can really, within one workflow step, have folks taking a lot of different actions and kind of tailor it to their role and what they need to do. You'll be able to set votes required for approval, just decide how many are included, and then edit your email template with different variables as well. So for each step of the process, you can let the requester know and let different folks involved in the process know what's going on. I want to talk now about decisions and logic jumps. This is where you're determining at the end of each step, what are we going to do with this request? So I've had an author submit this request, and now I'm having some folks review it. Maybe these are admins who are responsible for the spaces across campus or for the spaces in specific buildings. And we need to know what we're going to do with this after this gets approved or rejected at this step. One way to handle that is to build logic jumps that say, okay, well, when this is approved, depending on certain conditions, we're going to route this in some different directions. So this may be something where if the event type is X, we need to send this request over to Alicia. If the event type is B, we need to send this request to Joe in a different office to review. Or this can get very granular. If a specific resource is requested, we need to add an extra step and have the owner of that resource review this request. Or if no resources are requested, maybe we can skip a whole bunch of these steps and route this almost to the end of the review process. So you can imagine a bunch of different ways where this would become helpful. Maybe you have campus police that need to get looped in, security, catering, just depending on the different folks and the different resources that need to be involved. This does give you a lot of power in terms of setting up your workflow. And then you can determine the step that it goes to if those conditions are met. So that's how you can use logic jumps. And then we're going to talk about custom decisions. So in general, when you're building a workflow and it's relatively straightforward, maybe you add some logic jumps, but for any given step, we'll just assign a default next step. So if none of these logic jumps apply and we're just going to move this request into the next step of the workflow, what's going to happen? Okay, it's going to go from space review to room approvals. I just select that next step, and that's my default next step. But maybe I want a little more flexibility here, and I actually want to give folks the ability to take a couple of different actions here. Instead of voting to approve or reject at this step, maybe I want to give them more options. Maybe it's a little more complicated and we have a really commonly used space like a gymnasium or a conference center or something like that. And I want to have different actions here. So not just approve, not just reject, but maybe I need to route this to John or route this back to the author because I don't agree with the resources they requested, or this needs to go to the department or the owner of this building. I can build out some custom decisions here, determine what they're named, what they look like, what color they have, just some customizations to make it really easy to understand visually. But then I can open up this specific decision here. And let's just use route to John. And I can say, what's going to happen when this decision is applied? So if I want to select this decision, and let's say route to John, save, what I'll then be able to do is open up my decision here and say, okay, if we get 1 out of 2 votes here, 50% of voters want to send this back to John or ahead to John to review, I'm just going to select the step that says John review in this dropdown and bump this ahead or backwards instead of just 1 step ahead or rejecting the request entirely. So it's a great way if you need even more granular different steps or different room or resource approvers. You can really customize this workflow to whatever you want to handle there. Yeah, that's a pretty quick summary of what's available in Logic Jumps and Decisions. And with that, I'll pass it back to Alicia, unless there's anything in the QA that I haven't seen that we want to tackle. But it doesn't look like it, so I will return the screen share.
Awesome, thank you. So now that you've been able to see what it looks like to create a workflow in action, and also utilize those custom decisions and logic jumps, hopefully that adds a little bit more color to what we've shared previously. As we continue down the road of workflow basics, I wanted to talk a little bit about utilizing dynamic steps. So within the interface where you create a workflow or add a new workflow step, you may have seen the option to add a dynamic step with those. There's a menu bar at the top that I've screenshotted and highlighted here. And a dynamic step allows you to assign different approvers and reviewers automatically based on the department, the room, the resource, or the page owner. And so the options where you can find a dynamic step or where you can configure a dynamic step is really going to vary by product here. But this is really just an easy way to add a step in without all of the busy flow chart lines that can sometimes be associated with specific routing. And so within the events product, you can create a dynamic step using rooms and resources. In scheduling and curriculum, you can create a dynamic step using departments. And within catalog, you can create a dynamic step using the department or page owner. So what does it mean to configure a dynamic step in its specific part of the platform? So going into a little bit more detail here, as mentioned, this is taken care of in its respective part of the platform prior to you choosing the add a dynamic step option on the workflow page. So if we're using events as an example, you would visit the Rooms tab, you would choose the room settings gearbox that's in the top right corner. And in this visual on the slide, you can start to see where that's going to take you. And you'll see there's an option here for workflow settings. And so just as you would with any of the steps that Brian just showed you and what we discussed earlier, you're going to complete the requested information. So include the step name, include the participants, add the number of votes you would need, just like you would in a regular workflow step. Once this is completed, any requests that are for the example room that are here, which is GH 136, it will route to whoever you've listed as a participant. And of course, if it's then appropriate to add the dynamic step to your workflow. So as a reminder, you're configuring the individual rooms, resources, departments, page owners. You're doing that in advance in a specific part of the platform. And then you're clicking that add dynamic step option to your workflow. And so it's just going to look clean. It's just going to say resource dynamic step or room dynamic step. It's not going to show you all the nuts and bolts within that moment, but anything that you set up in the other part of the platform will automatically move into the correct direction once if that resource or room or department is requested as part of what the author submits. You'll also notice at the end of each workflow, there is a add post-approval step. And this is an optional step that allows you to notify someone on your campus who may need to take another action outside of the platform. So again, if you're thinking of a catering order that needs to be submitted, you can have a post-approval workflow step go to your catering office that is a reminder to them that they need to submit the catering request. Or maybe it's an IT setup that happens within the specific room. You can also use post-approval workflow steps to notify other offices on campus about changes that may have been made. So let's say there's a change in program that's happening. Your marketing team and admissions team may need to know about this so they can update their verbiage and they can update their documentation. And so this can be a way to notify them as well. So just think of this as an opportunity to notify someone outside of the workflow or within another office of a manual step that needs to take place outside of the platform. In this next section, we're going to focus on some steps that you can take on your own if your workflow is stuck. And these came from some of the most commonly submitted tickets as it relates to workflows. And the first one we have here is related to parallel versus sequential routing when it comes to having a request being stuck because it could possibly be within a parallel request. And so the first example we have here would come from curriculum. Sometimes multiple departments are required to approve proposals for cross-listed courses, and this can cause a workflow to get stuck. And so we recommend reviewing the request to determine whether it's set to parallel or sequential for approval by multiple parties. If it's parallel, it'll be sent to both approvers at once and will not progress until both of those departments have taken action. If it's sequential, each vote is going to take place separately. So our recommendation here is to make sure that it is not listed as parallel, which is sometimes what can cause it to get stuck. You can look at each individual step within the workflow, but there are also settings in the admin panel that you can set up in advance to have them default to. And that's what this visualization is here from the admin panel within product settings, an opportunity for you to just say in advance, hey, I want all of these to be sequential. You can still also change individual steps to meet your needs. Workflows can also sometimes get stuck on a dynamic step because there's not an approver assigned. So we just talked a little bit about how to configure a dynamic step, and this comes into play here. If you happen to encounter that your workflow is stuck on a dynamic step, we recommend that you visit the specific setting in the platform where that dynamic step was configured. And so again, this is what we walked through earlier. It might be rooms, it might be resources, it might be departments, it might be page owners. And you'll want to make sure that there is an approver assigned. You'll also want to make sure that this approver or this participant is active within the CourseDog system. So it could be that you typed in a user that actually does not have an account within the CourseDog interface. So you want to make sure there's an approver, but you also want to make sure that they are an active user within CourseDog. You should also verify that the number of votes is set to 1, especially if there are multiple approvers on a request. Sometimes if some of the votes are set to 1 and others are set to 0, then it will just bypass that step. So we'll want to make sure that it hits the right votes request log. And one last thing here that you'll want to make sure you do is choose that option to update the in-flight proposal. So after you go and make that change within the specific resource, the room, the department, clicking that button will kind of refresh it to say, okay, there's someone assigned to this now. It should move to the appropriate party. In the event an approver has completed their step, but the workflow does not progress, there's an option to reevaluate the request. And this is available within the proposal toolbox or within the toolbox in general when it comes to requests. And once you click that button, which you'll see the link down here, it should be able to move you to the next step. And while we are on the topic of the request toolbox, so there are a few different tabs within the request toolbox when it comes to reviewing requests, where they are, what decisions have been made so far. It really is a helpful tool to determine where it is and what needs to happen next for it to move forward with its approval. And so we do recommend reviewing this if a workflow is stuck. It can tell you who you need to reach out to and also help you start with that troubleshooting process. And this is another area that we're going to have Brian demo for us within the platform, just so you can get an idea of all the features that are associated with it and best practices for use.
Thanks, Alicia. And I know we have questions coming in QA. We'll definitely try to address them here and tackle them in just a minute as well. I did want to, while I have a chance to show a couple of things, talk about the difference between dynamic steps and basically just configuring a lot of logic jumps on one individual step. It's a great question. At the end of the day, in your workflow, a dynamic step functions in the same way as if you went ahead and created one step to review all of those conditions. So for example, here we have a room approval step that is looking at a bunch of different conditions. Depending on what organization is selected here, we're going to take this step to different parts of the workflow. Now, in events, I have two options for dynamic steps: room approvals or resource approvals. If I want to, and if I don't have 50 or 100 or 1,000 rooms and resources to deal with in workflows, I could very easily build a workflow step that works just like this, but for rooms or resources, and say if resource is X, route Y, if resource is A, route B, and do the same for rooms. The reason we've built dynamic steps is to make it a little bit easier, hopefully, to maintain these steps. So what you'll be able to do is come into your room or resource. And let me get to the right place here. Open up your room or resource settings and configure your workflow settings. So I'm going to assign these users here. I'm going to assign the different votes required for approval, votes required for rejection, basically configure my workflow step, but from within the room and resource settings. Then when I've created a dynamic step, we're taking these settings and just applying them into the step. The idea is that you may have many resources, many rooms, and we see customers with dozens of different workflows depending on how complex their campus needs are, how many different event types they have. These things can get very complex. Instead of having to build out a workflow step for 100 events each time you need a new workflow, you just add that dynamic step into the workflow, and we take these settings from rooms. So the idea is to save a lot of time in the workflow creation process and in implementation and in day-to-day maintenance of your workflows. But of course, if you did want to configure just a step here that is built on logic jumps and not use a dynamic step, you could do that and achieve the same end result. So I just wanted to point that out in case folks maybe do have some very complicated steps here that could be streamlined a little bit by using those dynamic steps. But that being said, let's talk request troubleshooting. 1 second to navigate back here. And let's open up our requests dashboard here. So I'll point out a couple of things. When you are looking for requests, we do have filtering and sorting. So you can sort by request creation or request the event meeting date for the request if you're looking for a specific request, or just kind of want to work through your backlog in a specific way. But let's find a open request here. And when you click into an open request, your toolbox is over here on the right side of the screen, contains 3 different tabs: decisions, workflow, and activity. Decision will be available if you have a decision to make on this request. You may be able to see requests that you are view only on, or maybe you're a super admin, but you're not part of this workflow and you're able to just see this request. So there may be no actions that you can take in the decision tab, or this may be where we're asking you to reject, send back, apply a custom decision, or approve this request. And this is where you're going to come in and submit your decision. Really valuable tab here that I think not everybody knows exactly where it lives is the workflow tab. So if you are being asked to make a decision on this request, we don't want you to have to go review the workflow in the workflow settings and figure out who looked at this, who didn't look at this. Do I need to email, Sarah in the events office, what's going on? You can just review the previous steps that have taken place and understand what's already happened and what will happen. So here I see that I'm assigned as a space reviewer. I see everybody else who's going to participate in this workflow, and I see what's coming up next. So maybe some votes have already taken place. I can see that Cassie and Pat already said yes or no before I make my vote. And I can see, oh, this will go through campus police review. I'm not being asked here to fully approve the event, just to move it on to the next step of the workflow. So This isn't necessarily strictly troubleshooting here, but it is a great way to understand where the workflow is at and understand what's already happened, what will happen, and make sure that you understand where you're at in the workflow. We also have the activity tab here, the activity log. So this shows all the activity that's taken place on an event. You may be seeing a request for the second time because it was edited, rerouted, and sent back through the workflow. You can come in here, check all of the edits that have been made on this request, leave comments, review comments that folks have posted, and again, just understand what's been happening in the workflow process. Let's say that you're reviewing these tabs and you think a step should have already been passed in the workflow, or that a workflow, or that this request is stuck at a workflow step for any reason. Great step to take to figure out what's going on is to open up your workflow step and say, okay, well, one vote is required for approval, one vote is required for rejection. We currently have 0 votes, not started. We don't see a red or a yellow, a green or a red mark here. This workflow is in the, this request is in the right step of the workflow. It should not have passed the step yet, but there is a deadline. What's going to happen at the deadline? You can see all the information. So great place to start to see if some of the basic criteria have been met. Do we have enough votes? Should this have been passed on or not? You'll see some workflow steps occasionally where no action was taken, but did it pass that workflow step? That may be because a deadline was assigned, and at that deadline, we pass that event on to the next step if no votes have been made. Or if it hits a certain deadline, we're going to send it back to the author because nobody took any action on it. There's a lot of information you can pick up here to try to understand what's going on with a workflow, and to understand, oh no, there is some issue here. 3 votes have been placed, but it hasn't been moved forward. What might be happening? Sometimes you want to reach out to your CSM or TSA and let us know there's an issue, and we'll fix it as quick as we can. Other times, lots of things could be happening. This step could be operating in parallel, it could be operating sequentially. There could be a lot more complexity, but this is always a great place to start reviewing that. And you'll also see a little tiny toolbar up here summarizing the workflow just in a different way as well. But these steps reflect exactly what you see in the workflow tab here. So that's a long way of saying if you're ever confused or wondering what's happening with the workflow, open up a request, go check out where it stands in the workflow tab. It's a great place to start your troubleshooting and to give a little more info if you want to reach out to us with a question. So yeah, that's what I wanted to cover here for the workflow section. Alicia, I'll pass it back to you.
Great. Thank you, Brian. And we hope that you all can start to use the toolbox a little bit more, again, to determine what step the workflow is in, what steps have already been taken, what's ahead, and just give you a general idea to understand where the request is. And I do see that we've had some questions coming through in the chat. So I think this is probably a good time for us to start to answer some of those live that may not have been answered so far by our customer success team. And let me see if I'm able to access those on my side. Yes. Right. So there's a question here about whether the global email, whether there's a global email template for a deadline reminder.
No, and Alicia, maybe let me grab the screen share here and I can just walk through some of these things as they come up. Let me get this shared. I'll get my QA open. So right now for deadline reminders, Jessica, there isn't a global template. And I'll just, this may be something you already know, but I'll just demo it for everyone's benefit here. When I do come in and create a workflow step, I have the option to create a deadline and set a reminder for that deadline. At the deadline, I'm able to choose what's going to happen. If nobody's taken action, are we going to reject this entirely? Are we going to move it on to the next step? Are we going to return it one step to the previous step, or maybe even route it all the way back to the author? So that's what we're talking about with these decisions. What I am able to do is, and this I actually think is where we have a limitation for most of our actions in the workflow. We're able to customize the email that's sent, use variables, and let folks know what's happened. For deadline steps, we don't have that. For deadlines, we don't have that currently. We send just a default reminder that says, this is close to the deadline. Please go in and check your request. We don't have that customizability for deadlines yet. We do have it for a lot of these other actions that you'll see here. Just reviewing some of the other questions, but Alicia, shout anything out that you want us to tackle?
Yeah, Edwin is asking about whether any of the dynamic workflow steps can function across platforms.
Yeah, Edwin, interesting idea. No, currently. But that is a really good idea, and we'll note it down as a request. And I'll try to follow up with you on that one, but currently, no.
And the very last one, where it looks like there's not currently an answer being provided, and from Dawn, she wants to know if there is a way to change it so we can enter the names of organizations, departments, etc., instead of the course dog code.
Yeah, so Don, we definitely know this is an issue at the moment. No timeline right now exactly for fixing this, but we will continue to work on that. I know it's a bit frustrating that we ask you to input the ID instead of just use that department as a drop down. So we are definitely trying to get that worked on.
And I see customer success is typing on this one. I don't want to steal your thunder, but while we're here, in scheduling, talking about building a logic jump intersection workflow that's routed based on the type of change, specifically within specifically for deleting a section. And this is from David. I might have butchered that, but
No, that's good. I'm just reading this one more time. Delete section. So David, let me just open up a workflow and let me come into scheduling. Show you what we do have that may help out here. So I don't think we have the exact step that you want to take here where based on the type of change, we can take a specific action. But, and this may be something that you've worked on already. So apologies if this is why you're asking this question. But we do have the ability to come in, open up a logic jump, depending on the type of field that you're looking at. Basically choose if the based on what the value is, what do you want to do with that field there? What I actually wanted to show here was a little bit different. Give me 1 second and I will pull up what I'm looking for. Oh, apologies. I think I'm thinking of an events feature. Right now, we don't have the best solution for handling this based off of the type of action that was taken. But follow up with us on this question. There may be some workarounds we can help you with here. We don't have a specific logic jump to support the type of form or the type of change request you're working on. But I'll take a look. We may be able to help you with a workaround. Just off the top of my head, I don't have a great answer for that one. And then we have another question in the chat from Anonymous that I see we're typing a response to, but the question is, the step needs to be built before it is added though, correct? That's correct. So when you're in the creation process here, what you'll do is add a new step and just fully complete the process of building it out before you can add. if for any reason you kind of want to save your work, it's really easy to just click the add button and then come back and edit. You can think of the add button as save. That step will be added to the workflow, and then you can complete building it. But it is kind of a thing that won't exist until you actually click add and save it as a step. Another
And then-
question.
Yep.
Yeah, is there a way to set up recurring reminders for proposals stuck in an approval step? So right now, for any given step, we only send one deadline reminder. So no recurring reminders. It's just a one-time feature to send that deadline reminder email, just a one-off email. See, Sam's answering another question, but feel free to keep them flowing if we have more that we can answer.
I have a question from John. So it sounds like John may have tried out that global step, but he's receiving a warning there. So that may be a going to submit a ticket on, so we can look into that further if you're receiving an error message.
Yeah, John, follow up with us on that one as a ticket, and we'll take a look. Cool, Alicia, I think we can move on from the Q&A here. I think we've tackled everything for right now.
Sounds good. Thank you. I will take the screen share back.
Yeah.
And we can this up. Again, the conversation does not have to stop here. We appreciate all the thoughtful questions that you all shared with us today. And hopefully they help some others on the call who may be experiencing something similar or have the same question. Please feel free to follow up with your CSM, and we are happy to help you continue to troubleshoot by supporting you and sending articles. And then, of course, if there's something we can't follow up on, we can touch base internally about what that looks like as far as ticketing is concerned. And so today, we hope that you were able to get more information about how to set up a workflow in its most basic state, configuring and adding those dynamic steps in the appropriate places, again, rooms, resources, departments, and also for page owners, and then also how to get started with assigning those logic jumps based on the criteria that you have set. This slide deck will be shared with you all, and so we have linked a few options here at the bottom that goes directly to our knowledge base, which includes more information about troubleshooting workflows, as well as just the basics of creating workflows, how to edit them, and then also how to duplicate them to save you some time and effort there. Following today's call, you will receive an email from Cassie the course dog with a brief survey about today's webinar, a link to the recording, and also information about our next webinar. So we certainly welcome your feedback about how we can continue to serve you here. Hopefully this serves as another opportunity and resource for you all as you get more comfortable with your specific product. And again, we appreciate everyone's time and attention today. To close out today's session, Amanda is going to launch a poll to gauge interest on some of our additional products that you may not be aware of or want more information about. If you could just indicate your interest by completing the poll, that would be great. So we'll give that a moment to cycle through. And once you've completed that, that concludes what we plan to share today. So again, thank you for your time. We hope this was helpful for you, and we will talk to you soon.
Thanks, everyone.